Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Alright, so before I dive into this video today, because I know it's got like a weird title and I've never posted this before, I just want to remind everybody that this is my last day to enter in my giveaway for a brand new hardcover copy of Catriona Ward's The Last House on Needless Street. If you are interested in entering to win this book, all you gotta do is check out my Instagram page at @VioletPrin, and it will have all the info on how to enter. It's super easy. It's like comment like the book that you're most looking forward to in 2022 and a couple other things. But yes, I will be naming the winner on Friday morning, so tomorrow morning. So please, if you are interested in entering, check out my Instagram page. Also, I'm so excited about these giveaways because I love writing letters and I love stationery, and whenever I give like a book away, I'm starting to try and include like a thank you note with everything. The first giveaway I did, I wasn't able to do that. It was in a collaboration and it was sent through Book Depository, but the last one I did, I was able to bust out some of my Crimson Hour stationery, and I just want to give that brand a really quick shout out. They make literally the most gorgeous stationery I've ever seen. Like, they get you their own little custom wax seals, and then these just absolutely gorgeous letters and matching note cards, and they're just like absolutely phenomenal. And I'm kind of obsessed, so I've been like crazily buying their latest stationery. So I just got like their winter solstice stationery, and I got this from their Haunted Mansion collection, which was part of their Halloween collection this year. And I love working with Ashley. She's so sweet. She's currently designing me my own custom Violet Print stationery. But check out Crimson Hour if you are into fancy stationery and really well-crafted letters and wax seals and note cards. She has all of these amazing things. She has like a Harry Potter line and a Lord of the Rings line. Like, she's just awesome. I'll link her info down below. She's got an Etsy shop and I adore her. Anywho, that is my like indie brand spotlight of the day. But let's talk about Scare-apy. So Scare-apy is a working title, but I really like it, and it is the concept of horror for mental health therapy. And it's something that I found pretty much during the pandemic to be something that really worked for me. I've talked about this a lot on my channel, but I do struggle with mental health issues. I have really bad anxiety, really bad insomnia. I get bouts of depression pretty frequently. And during the pandemic, I really leaned into Bookstagram and then eventually BookTube, which is how I'm here now. And I just noticed that the more that I dove into horror lit and horror films, that I just kind of had an elevation in mood a lot. And I've always been into horror ever since I was a little kid. If you ever look at my like sleeve, you can see that like Coraline, The Nightmare Before Christmas, Corpse Bride were some of my favorite movies growing up as a kid. So horror has definitely been something that I've always really leaned into, but it wasn't until very recently that I kind of started to acknowledge the benefits that it's had on my mental health. And there's not a lot of people who talk about this. I've read a couple studies online. I did just buy that book, A Nervous Person's Guide to Horror. But I just thought this was a really fascinating thing, and I wanted to start a series called Scare-apy, where I don't know if I'm going to be doing it weekly or monthly yet. I really am not sure. I was planning on launching this in 2022, but I'm really excited about it, so I'm going to start it now. But I really just want to analyze through different books and different horror films just how my brain works to basically alleviate a lot of the stress and sadness in my life and help me to be a happier person. I feel like we see a lot of times where like horror and darker things get blamed for causing people to act out, and I've always felt the exact opposite, that it's helped me to kind of just be better and feel better. So I just really wanted to talk about that and talk about how other authors have utilized horror lit and how directors have utilized horror films to convey certain messages about mental health. It's one of those things where I feel like mental health is a very constant metaphor used in horror. You see it a ton. You know, you can see it with Midsummer, with like the idea of grief. You can see it with The Shining, with this idea of the battle of alcoholism. Take it a step further, if we're going in the Stephen King realm, we can look at Misery as his basic like exploration of his own addictions and all of the metaphors that come through with that. And I think it's very, very powerful. And another thing that I've noticed a lot in horror lit and horror films is people with mental health struggles end up being main characters and not always the villain. And I feel like in mainstream media, we never really see that. So I think it's really interesting that this is kind of a world that exists that I feel a lot of people cheat into, but not a lot of people talk about. So I want to create just a place where I can talk about it. I have a bunch of episodes planned and a bunch of different topics I want to talk about. But I think today I really want to talk about my own personal experiences with a particular book, series, franchise, whatever you want to call it, and how it has helped elevate me mentally, and why. Before you think that I'm just making a lot of stuff up, I've done a decent amount of research. I'm planning on doing much, 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 much more. But I just want to pull a couple like quotes that I've seen recently, starting with this concept that horror and true crime, I feel like, can both go into this category together. I feel like there are a lot of people who you wouldn't expect who are obsessed with true crime. And it's this huge fad. Like, why does every single person that I know watch like Law & Order SVU? Everyone does, you know? And there's just so many times where like you can just get on TikTok and you can see so many people who want to break down various true crime cases. Why did Catching the Golden State Killer and Michelle McNamara's book just absolutely explode? Like, these are things that we're all very, very interested in, but they're also very, very dark topics. And this is from uwmedicine.org. But it's this concept that true crime and horror as well have this large selling point of allowing catharsis. It has all of, like, true crime and horror, they have all of the basics of good storytelling, interesting characters, a sense of urgency, tension that is in most cases released when the mystery is solved at the end, and therefore leading to that catharsis. From the same paper, this is from Emily Dworkin, who is a trauma research professor, and it says, experiencing emotions that could normally negatively affect us in real life in a safe, contained, and chosen environment can be very therapeutic. Experience difficult emotions in safe ways, like roller coasters or horror movies, again, can contribute to this type of catharsis, this release. And I think that's very, very, very true. And so I think the number one thing that I want to talk about in this particular video is the idea of horror being a safe space. Again, controlled, contained, chosen environment, I think, are the key words when you're involving yourself in horror. What's one of the things that you see a lot of people talk about when they read one of those super disturbing books that they absolutely love? They had to put it down for a little bit before they could come back. So it's this idea of when you induce this stress to yourself, you also have a chance to say no, fully control the situation, put it down and walk away. And when you're ready to pick it back up, you absolutely can. And that's definitely a large part of the allure for horror. And it's actually one of the reasons that my favorite book is my favorite book. So this video is primarily going to be talking about my relationship with Stephen King's It, as well as the films that follow, because I think they're very important to me. So if you have never seen this channel before, you've never heard me talk about this before, It by Stephen King is hands down my all-time favorite novel ever. And for many, 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 many reasons. But I think the most crucial for me is that Pennywise the Clown, the Tim Curry version, was literally like the demon of my nightmares as a child. My dad used to take me to Hollywood Video every weekend, and we would pick a movie that we were going to rent and watch. And my dad would always walk down the horror aisle because it was all the way on the far right end, and if you walked down it, you could easily cut into like where like the kids' movies were. And so we would always walk down there because it was the fastest way to get there. And I would always, always, always see that poster or that VHS cover of Tim Curry as Pennywise coming out of the drain with his creepy, creepy claws, and it scared me to death. I would cry when I would see it. I would freak out. I would cover my eyes in the theater or in the video store, and I don't know, I must have been like 4, and it terrified me. And I would have nightmares, and I'd never even seen the movie. I didn't see the 1990 It miniseries until I was, I think, 24. Because I was so scared of it. And as I got older and I became a horror fan and I was super into horror, I developed a fear of clowns. I was very, very scared of clowns. I remember being a child and going to Cirque du Soleil, and a clown came up to me and my mom, and the clown was messing with my mom, and I had a panic attack, and I freaked out, and I was like, this clown, like, get this clown away from my mom, like the clown's gonna take my mom. And so just my whole life, I had this huge, huge fear of clowns. And my best friend in high school used to always tell me that it was one of the best books he'd ever read. And he would say it over and over and over again. And I would always be like, nope, can't do it, not gonna do it. It's gonna scare the crap out of me. And as time went on, I slowly became a Stephen King fan. I started reading Carrie and Misery and Salem's Lot and a lot of like the Stephen King classics. And I heard they were making the It film. And I wanted to see it, but I wanted to mentally prepare myself for the film. So I bought the book. And I had to track this down because when they announce a film, they want to release a brand new edition of the book. And I had to really go out of my way and track it down because all of the publications, back copies had either been sold or put away, and I had to literally special order this on pre-order from my bookstore and wait for it to come in and then go and pick it up, which is exactly what I did. And I sat there and I stared at this book with this whole concept of I'm going to face my fears, I'm going to face my fears, I'm going to read it. And then I read the first chapter. For those of you who have not read it, and those of you who don't know the story, I'm going to read the first sentence for you. The terror, which would not end for another 28 years, if it ever did end, began, so far as I know or can tell, with a boat made from a sheet of newspaper floating down a gutter swollen with rain. If you have ever read it or seen it or really heard about it in pop culture, that sentence alone should tell you what the first chapter of this novel was. And it was so absolutely horrifying that I put the book down. It was one of the first times I had ever been scared and disturbed witless by a book. And I put it down. And I went and I had dinner with my dad and I told him about it. And he told me that that sounded like good storytelling. So I went back thinking, okay, it can't be that bad. It can't be that bad. That was one of the most creepy, eerie, disturbing, upsetting scenes I've read in a book. And it was. It was. It was just as bad as the first chapter. Worse, potentially. Worse, potentially, because the whole chapter is based on irrational homophobia and it ends in absolute tragedy. And I put the book down again. And for some reason, I just kept picking this book back up. There was something about the storytelling, there was something about the compelling nature of this story, and I just kept picking it back up. And there were so many times that I would get to scenes in this book. If you've read this book, the whole Patrick Hockstetter backstory, to this day, is the scariest, most disturbing thing I've ever read in a novel. But I would put the book down, and then I would pick it back up. And as I was reading this book, I was slowly facing my fears because I started to align myself with the Losers Club kids. At the first, the book, as you know, is told sort of in two parts, but they're kind of woven in between. So you see the kids in the 50s when they're like 12 years old, and then you have them 28 years later in the 80s. And it's two stories interwoven and paralleled on how they fight Pennywise the clown. But when you read them as children, you can see why they're scared of Pennywise. You can see how he creates fear, and you can see that he is this menacing force that you should be scared of. But as the book goes on, the children are able to break him down. So when they do have to go and face him as adults, they have a better understanding and how to not fear Pennywise. And I love how the book was able to do that for me as well. I was able to read along with the Losers Club and see myself get braver towards my fear of Pennywise. And by the end of the book, I was no longer terrified of Pennywise. I was absolutely scared of him those first two chapters. And Stephen King does an amazing job. I think Patrick Hockstetter is a really, really interesting villain to talk about in it, because it is proof that there are scarier people in the world than Pennywise. And I think as disturbing as the Patrick Hockstetter chapters are, it was definitely, again, that catharsis, that release that was needed in the novel of showing that Pennywise isn't always the true bad guy. There are people that are worse, and you can face your fears against this clown. That clown is the embodiment of what you're scared of, but you can grow up and get past that. And I thought that that was brilliant. And I will be honest, this book took me several years to read. I wasn't able to finish the book before I saw It Chapter 1, and I still went and saw It Chapter 1, but I did finish it before I saw It Chapter 2, which I thought was, I was absolutely fine with that. Normally I wouldn't want to see a movie before I finished the book, but this book was worth it to me. And I remember watching It Chapter 1 and just being so happy at how perfectly they conveyed the children in this story, and it just felt like the pages of the book really did come to life for me. And I didn't get that with It Chapter 2, and I never got that with the 1990s mini-series. But I think what was so effective is when I watched those children, I could really see myself in there. And after I finished it, I sat there for, I don't know, maybe 10, 20 minutes kind of digesting that I'd finally finished the book. And it hit me. It was like, wow, that was the best reading experience I've ever had. And it took me years to get through this book. Not because it was a slog, not because it was hard, but it was because I was literally overcoming my own fears. And I never felt so tied to a novel the way that I do with it. And apart from just all of that, I also think it is some of the greatest storytelling ever. I think it perfectly captures a coming of age story, what it is like to be a child who has to face really, really difficult things, you know? And Stephen King uses Pennywise as a metaphor for, again, real life situations that do currently happen. If you look at, we can take the smallest issues like Ben being bullied, right? Pennywise is his bully. It's both the actual bullies and then the fear that Ben has of the bullies when he sees them in Pennywise. You can look at Mike Hanlon's character. There's both Pennywise as what's chasing him, along with the racism in his town. Those are the two kind of paralleled overlaps. You can look at something that's just as tragic as well, where we look at Bill having to deal with the death of his brother and the grief that he and his family have to face and the isolation he faces from being kind of separated from his parents in their own grief compared to Pennywise. You can look at Beverly. You can see that the own abuse that she faces from her father is, again, as scary to her as Pennywise is. That's why Pennywise takes the shape of her father. And I just thought it was so brilliant and such a beautiful metaphor. And again, it would give people something that they could relate to. They could find the fear to overcome, and in reading the book, you do overcome Pennywise itself. And I just always thought that was absolutely amazing. And this is a book that really opened me up to the possibility of horror being a story for your own relatability. I think there are several different aspects of horror that can benefit you in mental health. Again, horror being a safe space. Reading it was a safe space for me because when I got scared, again, I could get stressed out and freaked out, but I could still put it away and have full control over it. Which then leads into another aspect of horror that I think is very important and how it benefits mental health. Again, empowerment. You have the ability to turn it off. You have the ability to walk away. You have the ability to pause it. You choose to be there. I think Cabin in the Woods is probably the best example of how this is shown in like a self-aware film. Not to ruin anything, but I've always thought that the gods in Cabin in the Woods are actually the audience, and that's why they are demanding that certain things happen certain ways, because that's what we expect. It's the formula we want. And that's why a lot of the most effective horror films nowadays are movies like Malignant or Hereditary, that both opposite ends of the spectrum, but both completely flipped the formula on its head. I think another reason that we turn to horror for mental health is because we can find, as I mentioned earlier, relatability. We can find relatable characters, we can find relatable situations, or we can find metaphors that speak to us. I think Midsummer, for a film, is one of the best examples of this. Yes, it is pretty much a retelling of The Wicker Man, but it does so in a different type of lens, where it really highlights the extremes of grief and loss and breakups. And yes, everything in that movie is absolutely over the top and extreme, and I do not condone ever putting anybody in a bear suit. But I do think that we end up relating, I don't remember her name, but to our main character's plight throughout that film. Yeah, a lot of horrible things happen, but when you get to that final scene and you understand like what's really going on, I feel like there's almost compassion for that main character that I would not have expected to be the end result, and that's not at all the result that you get at the end of The Wicker Man. Okay, and then I think another thing that's really important with horror is it creates a realm where we can have kind of understanding and empathy, maybe for things that we didn't know that we didn't understand to begin with. I think My Heart is a Chainsaw is a really, really good story to show the effects of abuse and how horror can be used as escapism. I think that it's not really a metaphor, it's pretty blatant and in your face, but I think it's a very good way to showcase that these are things that happen and these are ways people deal with certain things. If you read Come With Me by Ronald Malfi, he wrote that story because he lost a friend of his, and it was how he came to terms with his own personal grief. Heart-Shaped Box, I think, is an amazing example as well because it tells the story of somebody who doesn't understand depression or anxiety and how he comes to understand how it affects the people around him that he cares about. And I feel like that's probably one of the most important roles that you can do of balancing mental health with horror, is these are difficult topics to talk about, and it's really hard for somebody coming from like a moment of, or a place of like depression and anxiety and distraughtness, and being able to convey it to somebody who's never experienced those. I think Heart-Shaped Box is a beautiful way of laying out both sides of the stone. The person who doesn't understand anything at all and the person who's experienced it all and needs that person to actually finally get the picture. And of course, it's this kind of relatability and empathy that is created that would make something like It being one of my favorite stories, and coming of age horror being one of my favorite genres. Coming of age stories in general don't necessarily speak to me because I think coming of age story, even though it is about like the loss of innocence and growing up, isn't as detrimental if you don't have that horror aspect, because losing your childhood is not an easy thing. Growing up and realizing the world is hard is not an easy thing. And that's why I think books like December Park or Malignant Summer are also great coming of age stories to really hone that in. It's not easy growing up, and we don't talk about that enough, but I feel like it resonates so much with people when they go back and read stories about being a child and like the innocence and freedom that you had when you were 12, 13 years old. It does create that nostalgia, that longing, but you also understand why it's really hard to put a happy ending on a coming of age story, because again, it is that metaphor for growing up. You do lose being the child. And again, I think we find safety and compassion in reading about difficult topics that we've had to face ourselves, because what's the saying is misery loves company. And it's very, very true. When you know that you're not alone in something that's difficult to talk about, that these other people have experienced it, you do start to feel better. And I think this comes back to why I think Stephen King is such a great author. He's so good at putting his own hardships and tragedies into his stories in a way that conveys to the reader something that they've either experienced or something they need to understand about him. Pet Sematary being a great example of what it would be like to lose a child and the grief that a parent would go through to bring that child back. Luckily, that didn't happen to Stephen King, but it almost did, and he never forgot that. Again, like I mentioned before, if you want to talk about what it's like to be an alcoholic who hurts your family, The Shining is told from somebody who did just that. If you want to know what it's like to suffer completely from addiction, Stephen King wrote Misery for that. Annie Wilkes is a metaphor for his addictions, and how he felt as a writer succumbing to his addictions. So I think with that, this is where I'm going to leave this episode, kind of just as an intro to what I'm going to be talking about up in future Scare-apy episodes. I will be diving way more deep into certain topics, way more in-depth into certain books. Don't fully want to talk and spoil it for everybody, because I do think that everybody should read it, but I just want everybody to know where I'm coming from and my own personal stance on why this is my favorite book and why no other book that I've read has been able to affect me the way this book does. This is, to this day, the scariest book I've ever read. This is, to this day, the best book I've ever read. Sure, it has its flaws. It's got a giant talking turtle and a very, 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 very inappropriate scene with some kids in a sewer. But beyond that, I've never had a book that had any kind of effect on me the way that this one did. And I'm 28 years old and I'm no longer terrified of Pennywise. I think he is the coolest, most intricate character that Stephen King has ever created, and I'm so, so, so happy he exists and that I am no longer terrified of him. So yeah, that is all that I have for you guys today. As always, I post every Monday, Thursday, and sometimes on Saturdays. Keep on the lookout for more in this series. Let me know what books have helped you guys with your own mental health. Films as well. I don't usually talk about films in depth on my channel, but I think films for this series definitely help convey a message. So yeah, films and books that have helped you, leave them in the comments down below, and I will catch you all in the next one. Mwah.